Hello guys and welcome back to the Summit Studios YouTube channel. In today's video, I wanted to talk about when to model details versus just using a texture like a normal map or a displacement map. So it can sometimes be a little tricky to actually decide when you should model in those small details versus when to just use textures, right? To save time on complexity and just general effort. So the truth is there is no 100% black and white clear-cut answer to that question, as the same thing with a lot of things in 3D. It really depends on the use and the context. You know, is it going to be a realistic or stylized asset? How close to the camera will you or the audience see it? So on and so on. But of course, it's not always easy to decide on which workflow to use, especially if you're newer to this. So let's talk a little bit about when you might model details versus when it makes more sense to just use textures. So to begin with, in general, a good guideline to follow or good rule of thumb to follow is to model the large parts and larger details, as in the main aspects of something. If you imagine you had a car, of course you're going to model the wing mirrors, the tires, the wheels, any parts of the lights that stick out, that sort of thing, aerials that stick out and break up the silhouette of the actual vehicle. If you were to look at it just in pure, black on white, you would see those parts. Displacement for any mid-sized details, and then normal maps for anything that's really, really small. But again, just like I said, it's not always as straightforward as that, so let's get into it in a little bit more detail. So to begin with, just in case you're not aware of what normal or displacement maps are, let's start by talking about normal maps. They're essentially just a texture that fakes very small surface detail without actually having to add any geometry to the model, which will of course save you time and resources and makes the rendering a little faster. They're a little bit more efficient. The way that works is it actually changes the way light reacts across the surface, so things like scratches, grooves, bolts, fabric or panel lines can look 3D and react to light in the way that they would if they were 3D, even though the mesh itself is completely flat. They're really, really cool. If you've not used them much and you're very, very new to 3D, I would definitely recommend trying them out. A displacement map, on the other hand, actually changes the shape of the geometry at render time, not in the viewport, specifically at render time. Instead of just faking the lighting, it does physically push and pull the surface based on the texture values. So you do get real adjustments to that model at render time from a texture. So that's definitely much better for larger objects like rocks, bricks, trees and terrain in general. The only downside is that it's a lot heavier and you normally need quite a subdivided mesh for this to work. So just to add more confusion and nuance to it, right? So why might you want to use textures instead of modeling? What are some good cases for that? Well, one is very, very small details. Think like skin pores on your face, or panel lines, or like tiny screws and bolts on a vehicle. So sometimes the details on your model will be so small that actually 3D modeling them yourself almost makes no sense whatsoever. So a great example of this are pores on skin. These days, VFX and even game dev studios are creating some insanely realistic digital human characters with a lot of polygons and details, but the pores, despite that, are always, I promise you, still going to be a texture map because they're so tiny that even if you did model them, as insane as that would be, you would still not be able to tell the difference between what's modeled versus what is a texture map unless you got so very, 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 very close to the skin. But that's essentially almost never a requirement for the model, and that's going to be a running theme for this. It depends is the answer to a lot of this. So what that means really is that sometimes the details are so small that trying to model them would take so much extra time and make the mesh so much more complicated that it's just not worth modeling them, and you'd never be able to tell the difference anyway. So normal maps are very good at replicating small details like pores on your skin. The second case is potentially with details that won't affect the silhouette. For example, a cobblestone street or a forest floor in a game, for example. You're only really going to see those surfaces from a mid-range sort of distance, like over the shoulder of a character, or perhaps from like a first-person perspective, but generally from above or looking kind of, slightly forward and down. So normal maps will be really good at faking those details to a good enough level to create a good-looking surface without the extra geometry needed to actually create, each individual rock in that cobblestone street or each individual twig on that floor. And that's especially useful for video games, but also for environments in visual effects as well, if they're further away from the camera. If you really need those small ground details, you could use a displacement map instead, which will give you those raised surface detail without actually having to model it yourself. And that's often what a lot of people will do. But again, it depends. In games or non really high detail super close up work as well, panel lines on vehicles or weapons weapons and armor can also just be normal maps generally, since you're likely never going to get close enough to notice that they're actually part of the model. And normal maps, they generally use way less resources and they're a lot more time efficient actually modeling these details. With that said though, specifically within games, this seems to happen more often than in VFX. A lot of models are made high poly, so a lot of those parts will be modeled, but then it's turned into a texture map, be that a normal map or displacement map for the games themselves, just because then it's easier to run at real time. So that's another consideration as well. You know, how long do you want your render times to be? What's the purpose? Is this for, you know, a path trace traditional render for a still image, or perhaps a 3D animation, or is it for games? You know, that's something that's going to affect your decision on whether or not to model those details or to just use a texture map. With that being said, when might you actually want to model the details instead of just using those texture maps like we've just discussed? So one time really is when it's going to affect the model silhouettes, okay? If the details are going to affect the silhouette of the model, and by that I mean it sticks out and would make a large difference to the outline, then yes, absolutely you would model that in, okay? Because a normal map obviously isn't just going to do it. A displacement map might, but again, displacement maps are much better at terrain. So for example, bricks sticking out the corner or the side of a building, also all like spikes on armor. But even then, you may use displacement maps for the bricks, as modeling them all would take so much more time versus just using a good displacement map that does a lot of the heavy lifting for you. But that's again only in the use case of, you know, bricks and terrain and that sort of thing. So if it breaks the silhouette, generally you want to model it in. The other case is if you're going to get very, very close. If you're modeling something that's going to be really, really close to the camera, it's a very, very like sort of hero asset. If you imagine it was something that was going to be shown close up in a TV show, a movie, a live action video game trailer, or some sort of product animation, then it makes way more sense to actually 3D model all those little details yourself. A great example of this would be a 3D render or animation for a product like a watch. Okay, believe it or not, a lot of companies will use 3D rendering for car advertisements. Whenever you see those kind of cinematic car adverts or cinematic watch adverts for Rolex or whatever, generally that's all 3D, believe it or not, but you can't tell because the models are so pixel perfect and photorealistic. Then of course you would model everything the same way that it's made in real life, like the individual screws and the raised lettering on the watch face. But with that being said, you wouldn't necessarily model scratches or tiny surface imperfections, okay? That would be more of a texture thing. So even then, there's levels to it. Of things that you wouldn't model, and that might seem obvious, it might not to you. So, and the reason you do this is because you're going to notice those details are not physically accurate if the camera is really close, okay? And the goal is hyperrealism in those specific use cases. Were the camera further away, or if the model was for a different purpose like a video game item, then of course it wouldn't be necessary. You can just use normal maps and call it a day. So how do you generally choose between what to model or what to use textures for? So again, it all depends, which is not the most helpful answer, I know, but it's nuanced and it really depends on what your use case is. And where the model is going to be. So as I explained, if your model is going to be in the distance, like a far off building or car, or only seen from very, very specific angles, like perhaps a street floor or forest floor, then you're most likely not going to need to model in all of those individual rocks or panels because you're just not going to notice, and all it will do is negatively affect your render times. This is especially true for games where optimization is really, really important, but it's also true for VFX and other high detail work, as you don't want to just waste time and resources for the sake of it, like skim pores, for example. That's one quick way to get yourself in trouble in the VFX studio if you ended up doing that. It just doesn't make sense. If you're working on high-end advertisement for watches or cars, etc., where the aim is photorealism, then yes, model all those details. If you're not working in a studio, then at that point, the choice really just becomes up to you, though it's still good to be efficient to improve those render times. If you're working on something solely for yourself and time is no object and complexity is of no concern to you, go ahead, go wild, model absolutely everything that you want to, work on that insanely long project. You know, that's amazing. You see models like that come out occasionally, and it's always incredible to see the technical level of knowledge and ability and patience that's gone into making something like that. The main point that I was trying to make in this video is that it's not always necessary. It really depends on the use case of what you're trying to make. Okay, so I hope that's in some way cleared it up. If it hasn't, please do let me know in the comments. Ask any of your questions. I'm always happy to answer those. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.